Right here, I'm addressing two questions. Who made the forgeries? And right, and what are the clues that enable them to be distinguished? Here's my list of the chief producers of Large Hermes Heads forgeries. I won't go all through this again. We got started on the recording late. Perhaps sometime I'll do a revised version of this. You know, there are always new items to add in a presentation like this. So maybe there will be a chance to return to this subject. Here, all the stamps on the top row are genuine one lepton stamps of different issues, and the bottom two are forgeries. Spirati forgery, the most famous and accurate of all. And now we go on to two lepta stamps. These, by the way, these two lepta stamps are probably the most difficult to identify as to the issue of any of them, because in some cases the colors are so faint and smudgy that you can't make out the details as well as you can on the other stamps. Once again, the top row is all genuine stamps. We have here a Paris print, a consecutive print, then one of the prints that are described as on inferior paper. It's generally inferior in every way, and finally on cream colored paper. The bottom row is all forgeries. And on the left, we have a Fournier forgery. These are rather easy to recognize once you know what to look for. All the colors are rather washed out. There's a very strong white line at the back of the neck. Now, on this two lepta stamp, it doesn't show up very well, but we'll see more Fournier forgeries later where it does. The cheek shading lines are very characteristic. They tend to be rather straight lines across the face, not curved and not as varied in length as the genuine stamps. Also, there's no secret mark. Right up in this area here, there should be a break in one of these lines, and it's not there. The next one is one of the Onelia engraved forgeries. You can't, once again, because the color is kind of smudgy and faint, you can't see it as well as you will later on some of the others. But this background is all created by, you know, hatchings. It's engraved lines, which are not on the original. You know, the original is a solid background. It might have little white specks on it, but it's not consisting of lines like this one. So you see how sharp this image is. It's a beautiful stamp, beautiful, you know, forgery, but rather easily recognized as not original. And finally, two examples of the early Spiro forgeries. These are sometimes described as the chubby, cheerful Hermes and the poor, sad Hermes, both produced by the same company, different versions. This one is it's so crude. It's, I mean, truly ridiculous, but produced, you know, very soon after the stamp started coming out. So obviously they weren't very serious about imitating the look of the genuine stamp, but it gave collectors something to put in their albums.
Were the forged cancellations applied to each stamp, or were they done as part of however many they produced in mass?
Well, that's a good question. And I think the answer is both ways. In some cases, a fresh, you know, printing plate, it might have been a lithographic plate or an engraved plate, was used to create the stamps. And then the cancellations, you know, the fake cancellations added. The Onelia stamp has what they call a rhombus of dots. That's a very common kind of cancellation on these stamps. If the the forgery was created by photographing an original stamp with a cancellation, you would get the cancellation and the stamp in one shot.
Looking at the Scott catalog, virtually every stamp of this design is listed in 3 or 4 shades. Right. Olive, bister, or brown, or brownish, just to complicate things further.
Oh, yes. Well, I'm only showing you a few examples of all the different varieties of the genuine stamps. I picked out a few, just to give an impression of the variety that exists. But you're right, there are many more issues I don't show, and within each issue are various shade varieties. Yes, and it gets more extreme with some of the higher values. The 40 lepta stamps, for example, are widely various in their colors. I've read several books about these, and the printers of these stamps literally mixed up the ink every morning when they went to work to get a color that was what it was supposed to be for the value they were printing that day. And this was all done by hand, by taking pigments and mixing them together. And there's sometimes different amounts of different dyes or pigments were combined, and they got all kinds of varieties of shade. So now the 5 lepta stamp, and here I show the backs of the stamps to show you these control figures, which are a very useful part of the method of distinguishing the different issues. So everything here is genuine. And in many cases, you can identify the forgery partly by the fact that it doesn't have the control figure. It has a blank back. Now, you see, there are 2 stamps in this series that have no control figure. The Paris prints have no control figure except for the 10 lepta, which we'll see later. That has one, but the 5 lepta stamp has no control figure. And the cream paper printing, at least the later cream paper printings of 1880 to 85, had no control figure. So if you have a stamp with no control figure, it's got to be either a Paris print or a cream paper print. And if the paper doesn't match up, then it's probably a forgery. The second stamp in the row here is one of the early, what they call first Athens prints. I don't have the Scott catalog number here, but that's part of the Scott catalog listings, the early Athens prints. And it has a very characteristic control figure. This 5 was only used during that early Athens printing period. And later they changed the 5 for some unknown reason. They used a different figure 5. So this is one case where it's really easy to identify the early Athens prints. In other cases, it's not so easy because the control figures are the same. There are cream paper stamps with control numbers.
Really?
Yes, between 1875 and 1880, they had control numbers, and then using the same cream paper, later they were printed without control numbers. And they have different Scott catalog numbers.
Yeah, that starts at number 43.
Yeah, and then the ones without control figures start at number 53. So this is a consecutive print, and you see how faint. One of the ways to identify these early stamps from 1862 to 67 is the control figures are rather faint. As they used the stamping devices, it created the control figures more, eventually the metal just wore down and created a more, a darker, cruder image. So that's one of the ways that you can tell that it's a later print. So now we want to go on to the forgeries. Again, we have the same genuine stamps on the top row and 3 forgeries on the bottom row. The first one is, again, a Fournier. And again, you see the washed out color. In this case, he actually has stamped on here the word faux, F-A-U-X, here under the cancellation. And again, you see, in this case, you can see it, the strong white line on the back of the neck. There's a white, the back of the neck can have a white line on the genuine stamps too, but in these, it goes all the way down to the base of the neck, and it's very strong compared to the others. And again, no secret mark and no control figure. I don't show the back of the stamp here, but I can tell you that it has no control figure, so that's one of the clues. This, again, is one of the crudest forgeries I've seen, and I cannot tell you where this comes from. It's described in the book that I mentioned by Bill Ewer, but he didn't know where it came from. And I mean, this, if you notice here, these decorations on the side are called meanders, the meander decoration. There's only 3 here. There's supposed to be 5. Finally, again, another of the Spiro forgeries with chubby, cheerful Hermes. So now we're on to the 10 lepta. Again, this is all genuine stamps. And you see here the Paris print has a control figure. In fact, it has a large control figure. This is, absolutely unmistakable. It's 8 millimeters as opposed to 6 millimeters. So this is a very, very easy stamp to identify. The next two are both consecutive prints. I showed two because they use two very different papers and different colors. These are both stamps issued between 1862 and 67, but that was a long series of printings, and there are many shade varieties as well as paper varieties. So you've got this sort of vermilion on blue, which is just a variety of the consecutive issue. The next one is the so-called meshed paper, which is pretty easy to identify. You hold it up to the light and you can see. You can't see it on the screen here because you need to have light coming through it to really see, but it's a very easily identifiable grid, which you can see if you hold the paper up to the light. And finally, cream paper. And you can see how different the color of the cream paper is from all the other colors. That makes the cream paper stamps some of the easier ones to identify. So now here are the top line genuine and the bottom line forged. In this forgery, we have first an Alafi, the one on the left. A distinctive feature of this stamp is what they call the bulbous nose. The nose kind of sticks out. It has a little ledge there. I hope you can see that well enough. I mean, that's a distinguishing feature of this particular forgery. It also has, of course, no control figure on the back, which it should have. I mean, unless it was a Paris print, which it obviously isn't, by which you can tell just by the quality of the engraving. The next one is another example of an Alafi forgery in a darker color on bluer paper, just like the genuine stamps, exist in darker colors on genuine paper, on colored paper. Finally, the Spiro print again. Well, I'll go on to the 20s now. And again, we have Paris print, the consecutive print. The middle one, the third one, is what they call a cleaned plates print. I mentioned that before. You can see how kind of light and grayish the printing is compared to the, and also if you look at it closely, the lines in the spandrels are cleaner. There are fewer ink blobs and dots. The next one is a meshed paper print on dark blue paper. That same printing exists on other papers, but I show that just as, an example of the range of colors involved. And finally, a cream paper printing. The forgeries, we're back to Alafi again for the first one. And this is an imitation of a Paris print. Notice how fine the cheek shading lines are. There are certain identifying features. The short eyebrow. The eyebrow is supposed to curve around. You can see it clearly on the second stamp in the top row, but this one doesn't. And also there's a secret mark on this stamp, but it's not in the right place. There's a break in the line, but you can tell it's very clearly just not in the right place in relation to the meander that's next to it. So
the beads surrounding the medallion look very poorly done, particularly on the right side of that first stamp.
They're kind of blurry.
Yeah.
And look at the short mouth.
That's right. Well, of course, there are many slight differences, which, of course, there are also slight differences between the genuine stamps. So it's easy to be misled, and it really takes careful study to be sure that you've got something that is a result of its being a forgery rather than just a variety or, poor print of the original. As I say, the secret mark is in the wrong place. There are minor differences in the face and, of course, no control figure on the back. So that means, it either has to be a genuine Paris print, which it doesn't really look like, although it's a good imitation.
But there are forgeries with control numbers, right?
And yes, there are some with control figures, so you can't always rely on that either. The center one there is another one of those Onelia engravings, very sharp lines, beautifully done, but not at all like the original.
You can even see the crosshatch in the background on that.
Yes, that's
nice.
right. Now, in the background of the medallion, on some of the genuine stamps, there are lines. There is a grid shape on some of them, which result from the use of a cloth, a printing mat, shall we say, under the stamp. But the lines are vertical. They're vertical or horizontal, whereas in the Onelia engraving, they're diagonal lines, diagonal cross-hatchings.
What about the color on that one?
Yeah, that's
Alan?
true. I don't think I don't know of any genuine stamps that have that almost greenish blue color. The 30 lepta was a new value added only in 1876. But this was a result of some kind of UPU regulation that they had to create stamps to cover the rates for certain kinds of mail. They went back to Paris and had the Parisian printers create a new Paris print of 30 lepta stamp. And that's on the left in the top row. And it's just as beautifully done, just as finely engraved as the original series from 1861. Clearly different from the following two on the top row, which are Athens prints, much cruder. Again, all three genuine, and these stamps didn't have any control figures, so I don't show the back. The bottom the stamp I believe to be a forgery, but it's a very, very convincing forgery. It's one of the most dangerous I've seen, and this is something also mentioned in my source book. This is one of the toughest, and the reason I believe it to be a forgery is it does have some differences. You notice if you look at the eyebrow, again, we have a short eyebrow, which, could be just a fluke due to a light printing. The mouth and the nose are a little different. The line that forms the nose doesn't curve up as much as on the original. But to me, the most identifying feature is the white paper. This paper is just too white. The color is not quite like the original, but none of the original stamps, as far as I know, were printed on such white paper. Now, if this had been done by Sperati, he would have taken the trouble to color the paper to make it look like the original. But this, I believe, to be a forgery by Imperato of Genoa, who did, extremely convincing imitations. And it does have the secret mark, by the way, which is one of the reasons this is such a dangerous forgery. That's my opinion. Other forgeries do exist. In this case, according to my source book, most of the forgeries of these are in unused condition. The forger did not take the trouble to put a cancellation on. So that's another, piece of corroborating information, but it's hardly enough to be sure. So we'll go on now to the 40s, which are some of my favorite large Hermes sets because of the variety of different colors here. Again, all the stamps in this card are genuine, face and the back. In this case, I show the first two are both examples from the consecutive printing series, two very different colors, which are clearly identified in the catalog. And then the third one is the so-called inferior paper, and once again, a pretty inferior printing. By the way, the inferior paper prints are somewhat of a misnomer because the paper doesn't differ all that much from the preceding issues. But what happened is in 1870, as you know, there was a war in France, the Franco-Prussian War. And that war interrupted the supplies of papers sent to Athens. The Athens printers couldn't get the paper they usually used from Paris because Paris was under siege. So they used other sources and got other papers, but like I say, they're not all that different. So it's hard to tell from just the paper itself. The next one in the row there is the so-called meshed paper. And again, here they're using it almost like olive green color, totally different from the original violet. And finally, two cream papers, so a cream paper with control figure and a cream paper without control figure. The color of the control figure, if you look at the third stamp in the row there, that shows the color most clearly, that kind of a light red violet color. The famous rarity, the Solferino stamp, one of the rarest of all Greek stamps, was accidentally printed using the ink that was supposed to be used for the control figure. So again, one sheet is known, and it's believed that one sheet was printed and used, and there are something like a dozen or maybe 13 or 14 examples in existence of that stamp in that particular shade. They're only known used, and it's the rarest and most expensive of all Greek stamps. Catalog says 75,000. Okay, now the 60 lepta stamps. Once again, this was another value added in 1876 and printed first in Paris and then in Athens, with two very different results you see on the top row there. The Paris prints are on a greenish paper, and the Athens prints on more of a sort of a cream colored paper. The bottom row, all three are forgeries. Again, we have an Alafi forgery, which has all the characteristics. It has the tiny little bump in the top line that all of his forgeries have. There are other very slight differences that you really can't see without a magnifying glass. It has no secret mark. The second one there, which is again labeled faux, I saw this and I saw the faux printing, which looks just like the imprint on my Fournier forgery. And so originally I thought, oh, another Fournier forgery, but this is clearly not. The Fournier forgeries are all paler in color, and they have that strong white line at the back of the neck, which this doesn't have. So what this is actually is it's another Alafi. He made two different kinds, one to imitate the Paris print and the other to imitate the Athens print. Now on the one that's supposed to imitate the Paris print, he didn't get the color of the paper right. It should be a greenish paper. So that immediately tells you it's not a genuine Paris print. The Athens print, it's totally different in color from my example. And really, I don't think there are any genuine stamps in this color, but the printing details are more like the Athens printing. And finally, on the right, this is another Imperato of Genoa forgery. In this case, I'm sure that it is a forgery from that source. One of the ways you can tell, by the way, is notice how large the margins are. If you see a whole sheet of these forgeries, which is shown in my book, the spacing between the stamps is abnormally large, so that you could get a large margin, a sort of jumbo margin like that. On the original stamps, if you had a margin that large, it would show, the top line of the next stamp. So that's one indication. And also the shading lines, the face, stands out very strongly from the background of the medallion, but the shading lines are extremely faint, fainter than on the original Paris print. And that's characteristic of the Genoa forgeries. Very clearly printed, extremely well done, and it does have the secret mark, but you can tell just the printing doesn't look the same. It's too bright and crisp. Finally, the 80 lepta stamp, the last one I'm going to show. Again, here we have all three genuine stamps. There were not as many 80 lepta stamps needed or used, and they only exist in three different printings: the Paris print, the consecutive print, and the so-called clean plates print. Which, by the way, in this case, this doesn't really look all that clean. If you examine the spandrels, you do see some dots of ink, and it doesn't look really like a typical clean plates product. But you can tell by the control figure. Compare the zeros on those two eights. The zero on the right-hand stamp is darker, And that is a result of that 0 having been used more and worn down more. So it comes out darker than the 8. And that's one of the identifying features of that so-called clean plates printing. The plates were cleaned in 1867, and then they went on printing, using the same plates in 68, 69, 70, and, the plates got clogged up with ink again. So you can't always tell by the printing.
Is that gum on the back of the right-hand stamp?
Yes, that's gum and very dark. And I don't know if that's original gum. I think I only have 1 or 2 large Hermes heads unused with gum. And it's nothing like this. Finally, the forgeries. This forgery on the left is another one of these that's not attributed. I don't know where it came from. It is shown and described in my book, the book by Bill Ure. It has no secret mark, so that's an immediate sign that it must be a forgery. It has no control figure, which, of course, I mean, if it was a Paris print, it wouldn't have the control figure either, but it's clearly not that. The paper is too pink compared to the stamp next to it. And finally, the one on the right is another Onelia engraving. Again, a very beautiful, sharp image. I have had success buying lots of these things from dealers who just don't want to be bothered having to identify them. It's really difficult. And if you're a dealer, you're kind of on the hook. You're offering something as a certain issue, a certain Scott catalog number, say, and you have to be sure, or else, you could be selling something that isn't right. All right, well, that takes care of it.